Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Heartbreak is a painful part of life. When we're in it, it can be all-consuming, exhausting, and overwhelming. And to be sure, the skill to attend to it is not typically taught in school. But what is heartbreak, and how does it affect us? Why does the heart actually hurt when we're in it? And what can be done to fix a heart that's broken? Fortunately, I know just the guy to ask, and his name happens to be Guy. Dr. Guy Winch is an internationally renowned psychologist, the author of multiple superb TED Talks, and the co-host of a podcast called Dear Therapists with his brilliant colleague and fellow Super Psyched guest, Lori Gottlieb. He's also the best-selling author of several books, including How to Fix a Broken Heart. I love this book, as have thought leaders like Esther Perel, who said the book was well-researched and deeply practical. How to Fix a Broken Heart provides the validation, comfort, and hope anyone who is heartbroken desperately needs. So listen in as Guy and I talk about how to fix a broken heart. Dr. Guy Winch, who has asked me to call him Guy, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Oh, wonderful. I'm a longtime fan of your work, and we have a lot to cover. Primarily wanted to dive into broken heart, something that is not something really talked about much in the clinical experience, and yet it's so primary to being human and so insufferable when we're going through it. And I'm so glad that you actually attended to this in your latest book, phenomenal, as well as one of your TED Talks, one of your 3 TED Talks, I might add, that I came across, all of which were great. I was wondering if you could explain what is a broken heart from where you sit.
So I focus on romantic heartbreak, right? There are plenty of people who get brokenhearted when their teams don't reach the playoffs or that kind of thing happens. But I focus on romantic heartbreak, and what I define subjectively in the sense of some people can go on a single date with someone and have such expectations and that they can be truly heartbroken. And so what I define as romantic heartbreak is a form of grief. It's a form of loss, and people's responses psychologically, common forms of grief responses to loss. But this is in the realm of romantic heartbreak. So that's how I define it. It's based on romantic feelings. It doesn't have to be based on the length of the relationship or on the intensity of the relationship. It can happen after a long time, short time, but people experience a certain form of grief.
Yeah, and with the hopes and the quashing of the hope is so incredibly painful. One of the things that you and I are both aware of is that people would rather experience physical pain than psychic pain. And heartbreak really represents one of the toughest. And I'm seeing you nodding, so I'm seeing that you agree. I'm wondering, what can heartbreak teach us on the other end?
Heartbreak will teach us actually a lot. Let's actually start with when you say people would rather suffer emotional pain rather than physical pain. We know from fMRI studies that in the brain, those two look really alike initially when they were looking at what emotional pain looks at in the brain. There was literally, when we're looking at the slides, it was like if somebody just came in who wasn't aware of what the induction was, they wouldn't know that this wasn't physical pain. There are nuances, and you go deeper into the brain, there are nuances of difference, but they are so similar that in rejection experiments, when you give half the people sugar pills and half the people Tylenol, people who get Tylenol not knowing they had Tylenol would experience a little less emotional pain from rejection than people who didn't. They really are very similar in their circuitry in the brain. So first of all, we can learn from that emotional pain is to be taken extremely seriously because we experience it very similarly as we do physical pain. So that's a big takeaway.
And to be clear, I think I may have misheard you, but I want to be clear. We would rather experience physical pain than emotional pain on average. Is that what
you said? That most people would tend to choose that. That is true. I don't necessarily have a study to point at, but I think in general, that's true. And here's why. Physical pain has two components. It has the physiological component and it has the emotional component, the distress about being in pain. And emotional pain has a physiological component in the brain in that sense, a biochemical one. But the emotional component is huge. And so that's why it can really, people will sometimes be like, I'd rather just focus on the physiological sensations and try and limit, the emotional component. Where in emotional pain, that's just much harder to do.
And it can even explain in part why people engage in self-destructive behaviors like cutting so that they don't have to feel the emotional pain. Maybe you've seen the movie Flashdance where a guy's worried and his uncle smacks him in the stomach and says, now you don't have to feel your worry anymore. You can feel your... And that was in the 80s, a very funny moment. But now as psychologists in 2022, we now realize maybe not the best intervention of all time, but definitely it was really on the nose in terms of how we tend to deal with our own psychic pain. We'll probably want to blast it with something, whether it's a punch in the stomach or perhaps getting obliterated with alcohol or even self-harming like cutting. So I think that really speaks to just the depths to which we will go to avoiding these feelings, which can be so completely overwhelming. And I'm really glad and grateful that you included the loss of pet. There is nothing in my life that I've experienced that is remotely like it. How did you come to choose losing a pet as a component in addition to romantic loss as well? I thought that was really an important piece.
Because they are both unsanctioned forms of grief. When you lose a pet, and it would happen because I remember like when it started, this woman comes in, she's a senior lawyer, she's a partner at a law firm, and she had an incredible relationship. This is not the woman I wrote about in the book, a different person. She had an incredible relationship with her cat who lived a very long life. And when the cat died, she was devastated. She was she felt like she lost a family member, a first-degree relative, and she did not feel that she could go into work and say, I need a few days off to grieve. She felt that she would be looked at like there's something very wrong with you, lady, if you can't deal with your cat dying. Except that what we know experientially for sure, but from the research, is that people experience sometimes way bigger grieving responses to a beloved pet dying than they do to a first-degree relative dying, because the first-degree relative might or might not have been in their lives in whatever frequency. The pet was with them 24/7. Pet was in their lives on the day-to-day. And so both romantic heartbreak, that's another thing. Very few people in their 40s and 50s will go to work and say, my girlfriend dumped me. I'm going to be crying in the cubicle for a few hours. That's just not a move. It's not something we would support. If you're getting divorced, quote unquote, it's official. So maybe that gets more support. If you actually do lose a relative, then that would get more support. And yet for a lot of people, these are bigger issues. And so I felt they were so unsanctioned and so incorrectly. I wanted to highlight, no, this is why we need to take these two things seriously. We don't.
I love that you did that, because the idea of something being sanctioned versus not, when there's no institution behind it, we tend to quash it. And that can lead to complicated grief over time, because we think to ourselves, we somehow deceive ourselves into believing what we are told. And that is, this shouldn't be such a big deal, except for the fact that it is. Can you talk about how that may actually, that kind of, to borrow from Frozen, conceal, don't feel, don't let it show, might not be a great way to go in life, if you're familiar with that lyric from Let It Go? How might that portend over time the tendency to quash a feeling in the face of heartbreak?
So what happens is that you start to feel shame in a certain way. You start to feel like there's something wrong with me. When people are heartbroken, and this is not necessarily true with pet loss. With pet loss, people can feel embarrassed, quote unquote, that they feel so strongly and they go through real grief, but they're not desperate. I mean, they would desperately like their pet back, but they're not desperate in the day-to-day. Heartbroken people feel a level of pure desperation because the person is still around. There is at least in theory, and with hope, that you can get them back, or you can have another conversation, or you can get a better understanding, or you can clarify that thing that made them do the thing that you wish they didn't do. And maybe if you say the right thing, you can. So the level of desperation of trying to hold on to the relationship. People can't hold on to a dead animal, but they can hold on to a relationship because that person is around. And the level of desperation we see and the behavior that desperation causes with romantic heartbreak makes a lot of people feel like, I'm going crazy. I'm acting so out of sorts. This is not like me. And so they don't understand what's going on. Why? Because the societal thing is like, that's something teenagers deal with. As an adult, you should be able to shrug it off. And of course, that's not true. But that's what makes people think like there's something very wrong.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's coming through is that Paul McCartney's right. Love is everything. And all of the research seems to indicate, that our relationships matter. If you look at the Cambridge study over the course of more north of 80 years at this point, our relationships are number one. Loneliness, you and I both have studied quite a bit about loneliness. So we know the opposite of feeling connected. And it can be one of the worst of human experiences in addition to heartbreak. You've very correctly identified, I've heard you say that we have evolved over time to avoid the feeling of rejection and heartbreak at all costs because our survival historically has been at stake. And to be clear, we're also talking here about non-death romantic heartbreak. We're talking about when somebody's, nodding. And these nothing.
May I just correct something there? The survival imperative that made rejection so painful, because one of the things about rejection that's so interesting is that in studies, what people do is they set up an actual rejection experience. It's a fake one, but the person doesn't know that they actually get rejected by people. And then they are asked all these questions about how they feel, et cetera, et cetera. And it hits people hard in self-esteem. Their mood drops significantly, but they experience significant emotional pain, even from quite mild rejections, even from mild rejections by people they don't know. But then what the studies found, that if they then go and tell those people, you know what, this wasn't real rejection, these were our Confederates, it actually didn't happen. Or even in some conditions, the people who rejected you, this is still a ruse, but the people who rejected you are people you despise. Like they'll tell the Jewish subject that they were neo-Nazis and the black subject that they were members of the KKK, etc. It doesn't diminish the pain. And so the question became like, why are we so hardwired to experience rejection as so painful that even when we find out it was a mistake and it never happened, we don't feel less pain? And the idea was that it was an early warning system from our nomadic tribal histories that alerted people that they were getting on the wrong side of some people in the tribe. And unless they correct their behavior, they're going to be ousted, which was a death sentence when we were tribal. And so the idea is that there was a value in experiencing rejection as painful, in it being lodged in our brain and hard to dislodge, because that's what reassured those people that's what made those people change their behavior. People who didn't experience it as painful were less likely to change their behavior and then more likely to be ostracized and not pass along their genes. And so generations later, we are hardwired to experience rejection as very painful, even when we know it didn't even happen afterwards, and even when it shouldn't, and we don't think so, it does. It's just painful.
Beautifully articulated. And I'm wondering, Guy, if you could share some other common misconceptions that people might have around heartbreak itself and how you might disabuse the listeners of those misconceptions.
So a lot of misconceptions are shared actually by therapists sometimes. And those are that primarily the best thing you can do is, you can get emotional support. You can get validation for your feelings, but then it takes time. Then you have to, time will heal kind of thing. And why I, did that TED Talk and wrote the book about heartbreak is because, in other words, our natural instincts, our mind is going to actually make this take longer. Default instinctual responses to heartbreak are not adaptive necessarily. They're actually quite damaging. And on the other side, there are intentional, specific things we do need to do and can do to accelerate our healing. So there are things we shouldn't do that will accelerate our healing. There are things we should do that will accelerate our healing. And all of those go way above and beyond A, getting the emotional support and validation, and B, time. So, this is healing from emotional wounds in general should be an intentional, active, and proactive process rather than a passive one.
Brilliant. And what are some of the ways that a person can, in a healthful manner, attend to their broken heart? What are some things that you've seen work?
Okay, so first of all, our first instinct, which is going to make it all much more painful, is to stalk the person on social media. These days, I don't know why there are any private investigators still in business. When people put every aspect of their lives online, why does we need a private investigator to follow somebody around? Just look at their social media. They're pretty much telling you what they do. All of which is to say, when you got dumped and when your heart is broken and you want to see what's going on with the other person, you probably can via their social media or via their friends' social media. And that's only going to make you hurt a lot more for one reason. The person who broke up with you didn't most likely do it on a whim. They've been thinking about it. They've been planning it. often in consideration of things that might be going on in your life. Oh, they have the big presentation. Let's wait till after that. It's their big birthday coming up. I don't want to do it right there. But they are months and sometimes years ahead of you in the detachment process, in the disconnecting and in the rebuilding. And yet you don't realize that because you only know it from the time they told you. And yet 2 weeks later, there they are smiling at a party when you can't get out of bed. How is that possible? They've been thinking and disconnecting and moving away and drifting emotionally for months and months and months and months. But to you, it just looks cruel. I guess they never cared. And then it brings up all these questions. And how come we went on that vacation and it was fine if right afterwards? So people get really stuck with trying to understand what went wrong, trying to stalk the other person, trying to get closure. And I always say, don't get closure, because if the closure means go ask the person exactly why you broke up with me, God forbid they tell you something like that. Who wants to hear that? I mean, the litany of the small little pet peeves? It always boils down to they drifted emotionally. They were never fully committed in the first place. You grew apart. One of those boring explanations that doesn't feel satisfying, but is usually the answer.
And one of the quotes, and I may be paraphrasing, that you shared was that after heartbreak, your mind will lead you down the wrong path. I was wondering if you could speak about how the mind may deceive us. I mean, you've kind of spoken about it, that our tendency is to try to find answers and to cyberstalk, but how else might the mind not be the most reliable tool in the face of heartbreak?
So two things tend to happen. Number one, I do want to point out another functional MRI study, which is important, which is what we see happening in the brain when with romantic heartbreak is a similar kind of withdrawal than we see happening when opioid addicts, literally cocaine, heroin addicts, are withdrawing from cocaine and heroin. In other words, there is a physiological feeling of withdrawal and a physiological biochemical need to have that substance to gain a fix. Now, if you think of a heroin addict who's withdrawing, nothing they do would pretty much surprise you. They would do something illegal, something desperate, something debasing, something humiliating, something horrible. They're like, well, the heroin addicts, they're that desperate. So are heartbroken people, because the brain can't really tell much of a difference between heartbreak and heroin withdrawal, in certain, where heartbreak is really bad. But if you don't know that, then you don't understand why you're acting so desperate. And if you don't know that, you are judging someone who is acting desperate as being off their rocker rather than like, no, this is what's going on in their brain. Their brain is making them that desperate. But the other thing your mind will do, that's not your brain, but your mind, your thinking, is that it will tend to idealize the person who broke your heart. So when you think of them, you won't think of the time that they really pissed you off. You won't think of, when you look at pictures, I've literally seen people, I've said to people, show me pictures on the phone. They will rapidly skip through the pictures in which the other person doesn't look good or they don't look happy and focus on the ones in which the most idealized, perfect ones that you would frame, except that that's not a realistic snapshot of what the relationship was like. That's what your mind is trying to tell you that you lost, which obviously makes the pain worse and sets you back. So your mind is going to be very interested in telling you that what you lost was way more substantial and way more meaningful and that you need it. And that's the source of your happiness to come. And if you can get that back, all will be right. And if you can't, nothing will be right. Those are the messages your brain is giving you when you're heartbroken. And that's what's sending you down the wrong path, because you're going to spend a lot of time trying to get that person back and doing all the crazy things that people sometimes do in order to do so, even though it's really not good for you and really not the right thing to do.
And I would imagine exacerbating this bias, this tendency to look at our relationships, which were highly flawed, perhaps in these sepia-toned images of our mind of it having been perfect, is akin to cognitive dissonance theory, where I wouldn't have been with this person as long as I was if it wasn't that great.
There's that part of it, which is true. But I've worked with people who literally a week before a breakup spent an entire session talking about how they want to break up because they're so unsatisfied, because this isn't going anywhere, because this isn't the right person for them. And they're just trying to figure it out and they're not sure yet, but they're pretty sure this is not for them. A week later, they come in devastated. And they truly are. They're not manufacturing it. They feel truly devastated. Now, when I remind them like, yeah, but a week before, weren't even sure you wanted to be with this person. You were so focused on all the flaws. You were so focused on all the compromises and all the sacrifices and all the ways in which they weren't right for you. Where does that go? But that doesn't appear. That's the thing that your mind does to you and sends you down the wrong path. It would be super helpful if your mind reminded you of like, no. Think of this. But that's not what happened. It's the opposite. So this is why I'm saying like you need to take the reins. You can't just assume that what your mind is throwing at you is the gospel, is the truth. it's highly curated and not in a helpful way.
And a component of this is that being rejected is so much harder in many ways than being the one who rejects. That conflicted individual who was really ambivalent at best about being in her relationship was devastated when she was dumped. And all of us have experienced that to some extent. And I'm thinking about the pain of rejection and part of your own arc. You were a comedian before you were...
No, I was a psychologist and I started doing comedy after 9/11.
Oh my God, no way. Okay, so in addition to being a psychologist, you're also a person who's willing to get up on stage facing the great possibility of bombing and rejection as a comedian. And I'm wondering, how did you decide to become a comedian? What have been some of your gleanings from standing on stage? And I know you're funny because I've seen your TED Talks, so I know that you've got chops. What's that like?
So that came about, and I no longer do it. I did it for, around 3 years quite intensely. But it came about after 9/11. I live in New York City. All my practice, everything I was doing was dealing with the aftermath of 9/11. It was a lot. A year or so after that, I decided I need to do something to balance all the pain and the distress and the trauma and all the things that I was dealing with, as somebody who had a private practice in the city when that went on. And I always thought, I want to try comedy. Except that I didn't necessarily have a fondness for humiliating myself in front of people while standing on stage. And as anyone who knows who might have tried it, it's not as if you go, you tell jokes, everyone laughs, off you go. There's a long learning curve in which things don't go well a lot of the times, etc. So what I did is I decided I'll just take a class, that 6-week kind of class, do a friends and family show. It's a forgiving audience. And there'll be, get that out of my system, which is what I did. But the show at the end went so well, for me at least, that the owner of the club came to me and said, I know this was just a graduation show of a class you took, and I never spoke about being a psychologist on stage because I wanted plausible deniability. If any patients were there, I didn't want them to think, I'm going to share my life and that's material now. So I never spoke about being a psychologist on stage, but the club owner doesn't know that I have a career, comes over and says, can I hire you to do a gig next month? And I came off in such a rush that I said yes. And then I realized I don't have enough material for that. And so I started running to open mics to work out new material. And then I did that gig and that went well. And before I knew it, I was closing my office at 8:00 and 6 nights a week, I was going up on stage. And by stage, I mean some kind of shithole basement, because when you start out, no one's paying you to be on stage. Telling jokes to drunk strangers. Sometimes they would bus in tourists who didn't speak English because that kind of thing. And you're like, no English at all at the comedy show. That's very good. So it was painful at times for sure, but I really, really enjoyed it. It allowed me to exercise such a different aspect of my personality it did what I wanted it to do. It freed me up significantly. It turned out that was incredibly useful when it came time to do TED Talks and public speaking, that when after you've done comedy for 3 years, you have a little less stage fright than you might had you not. And you also can be good on your feet because you're hosting shows and you're doing things. So the skill set that you acquire was very, very useful. And I enjoyed it thoroughly. And there's one aspect of it that I enjoyed I just want to highlight briefly, which is, as somebody with a Ph.D., I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. Stand-up comedy is the closest thing to a scientific method than I can see outside of a lab. Because here's how it works. You come up with a theory. The theory is your first draft of a joke. The theory is this will be funny. And then you do the experiment. You try it in front of an audience and they laugh or they don't. Your theory is confirmed or not, usually not in absolute terms. And then you go and you tweak it or you rewrite it. And then you improve the experiment and run the experiment again. Prove the experiment, run the experiment again. It is an entirely experimental method. Every stand-up comic who comes on stage sounding casual, like they're just thinking off the top of their head, has run that joke 100 times at least and done the experiments over and over and over again until the result was consistent. It is a scientific method. I know most people don't think of it that way, but to me, I did. It was like these are all scientists. They don't think of themselves that way, but they are.
I love that perspective, and that makes total sense. You get real feedback in real time, and you know how to tweak and see how and adjust and see how it works at the next experiment. And I'm still kind of fascinated by the fact that one of the things that I love about comedians is that a cost of doing it well is bombing. And that means rejection. What's that like for you to bomb and be rejected in that way? And did you eventually develop kind of coping strategies around that relate to the broken heart?
I developed, yes. So yes, the coping strategies that I and all comics develop around is that you need to do a lot of shows. If you have one show a week and you bomb, you're going to be really afraid to get up on stage the next week. But if you're doing 2 spots a night and one of them doesn't go well, you have another one. And if that one doesn't go well, you have the next night. And so you learn to absorb it because again, it's a scientific method. You learn something from it and you have enough of them coming along. And in that vein, I often suggest to people who are out in the dating world, who are afraid of rejection, it's like if you're going to set up 1 date a month, you're going to be very prone to feel rejection as painful. But if you can set up a series of first dates because you really don't know how they're going to go, and if one goes really well, by all means, feel free to cancel the others. But if you know, but I have another one tomorrow night, so that hurts less. That's how I would relate it to that. It's the same principle with cold calling. It's very difficult to cold call somebody with a request. But when you're working for a call center and you have to make 100 of them in the next 3 hours, the first person who curses at you and puts the phone down is just like, oh, and on to the next one. So again, it's the volume that can really help.
So you've got comedy as a form of rejection exposure, and I actually have sales. I did sales for a number of years and very high attrition rate amongst my peers, as you might imagine, because of the rejection component. What you've described are frequency and context in response to the rejection and bombing. And that is that I do it a lot. And I suggest that people who date do it a lot. So, and context, holding it in your mind with a particular meaning of I'm doing this for the sake of blank. And I remember in my own dating process, before I met my wonderful wife, I did exactly that. I almost viewed it like I was shooting a 30 days type of documentary with Morgan Spurlock, kind of a supersize me approach of like, this is a series of interviews over coffee and let's see how it goes. Yeah, and you're nodding. So that
I often say to people when they go on a first date, the question, and this I say a lot of people, like, don't assess whether this is your life partner, even if you're looking for one. Your only question is, did you enjoy it enough to want to go on a second one? And did you enjoy the second one enough to want to go on a third? It should be a while before you start asking the big questions, because it's going to be a while before you get to know this person more than a lot of assumptions, filling in a lot of dots because you do not have a lot of dots to tie together.
I'm just appreciating that you and I think, of course, I love the fact that we think similarly in so many ways, as evidenced by your love of comedy and your fascination for the importance you place on pet loss. And what I really try to get my clients to do when they're in the dating process is to engage in what I call the drive-away test. Like, what are your thoughts and feelings as you drive away? Notice all of that stuff. And be willing to assess almost like a scientist, be detached from the outcome, get to know the person for a number of, preferably, expect that if this is something long-term, you're going to need a few seasons with this individual before you really know how the two of you interact as a chemical combination. And how well do you travel? How well do you come to consensus? Who needs to be right when you argue? All of that stuff. And so I really am appreciating how you're putting it into frequency and context as a coping strategy in and of itself.
Can I just comment on what you just said, though?
Oh, absolutely. Please. Oh, yes.
I use exactly the same criteria. I say to people, like, until you've had your first fight, until you've traveled together, until you've been through the holidays together, you don't know the other person that well.
I totally agree. Until you've traveled, until you've, preferably in a place where things can go wrong. Because
preferably when you actually have to be honest, either a long car ride can do it, a plane, like I know people who literally by the time they get to the airport with the other person are already composing the breakup text in their head because just getting to the airport and checking in was so traumatic that they're like, oh, no. And you don't know how people argue because people can be very well regulated. But then do they really double down? Are they able to hear another perspective? Do they lose their compassion? Do they lose their inhibition? Do they really go to a dark place where they argue and become another person? Does their face scrunch up in ways that make you feel like, yikes? In other words, and how do they do conflict resolution, even if there was a bad argument? So those are critical things. Relationships can't succeed without them. And so you don't know that until that happens. So, a month in when everything is rosy and amazing and it's the honeymoon period, great. Hold some in reserve. You don't know yet.
And I remember learning a term on the L Word, I believe it was a Showtime series, about the urge to merge we humans often have, which can be a beautiful thing in and of itself, but it can also deceive us to attach too quickly. And I'm wondering, you're nodding as I say this, in your perspective, where does that urge to merge even originate?
I think it originates in the fact that first of all, I think very few people find the dating process incredibly enjoyable. It's fraught for almost everyone. Maybe there are a few people out there who are so attractive physically or otherwise that for them, it's just picking. For most people, the swiping and the rejection and the ghosting and then this one. And what I hear even more lately was that we had a 5-hour date. We made out at the end. It seemed great. And then she didn't want to see me another time. Why would she make out with me and come up to spend 5 hours? Like, I don't get it. Like, it's a very difficult process. So part of the urge to merge is to not have to go through this gauntlet. Can I just find the person and then have to go through this? That's part of the urgency, but don't buy too quick. Like, you really need time to evaluate the merchandise and to make sure it fits into your life. But that urge and again, it's connecting a lot of dots that you don't have and drawing a picture that is a supposition, is an assumption, a hope, rather than based on reality. So you have to hold back a little bit. You have to proceed with caution until you know some of these things.
Couldn't agree more. Guy, one of the things I appreciate about you as a psychologist is you bring your whole self, all of your experiences, all your talents, all of your areas of interest into the encounter, everything from the fact that you've lived overseas to the fact that you have done comedy, that you're an author and you've given talks and you do a brilliant podcast with Lori Gottlieb. And one of the things that you also bring to the encounter is that you are an identical twin, which gives you an unusual perspective on the human condition. I'm wondering, what have been some of your gleanings around broken heart, around life, existence, urge to merge, anything we've talked about, and even things we haven't, that you've experienced that you can describe as a byproduct of you being an identical twin?
Well, let's start with something really, really basic. And that is that when you study psychology or therapy, I would challenge anyone to tell me, and other than birth order, what did you really learn about the significance of siblings? It's all about the parents, right? The influence of your parents, what your childhood was like based on who your parents were, who your caregivers were. Siblings are neglected a lot of the time, unless you had a sibling who was very, very bullying or very, very difficult, or you had a sibling that had so many problems that they were centralizing and taking all the attention away from you. But my experience as a twin is that siblings are incredibly important. My relationship with my brother was, in my estimation, at this vantage point in my life, more significant to my development, to my psychological, emotional development, to everything that happened in my life than my relationship with either of my parents. But if you want to look to literature, if you want to look even to how most therapists, a lot of therapists will treat somebody without even knowing what the sibling constellation is. And so that's the first thing, that siblings can be incredibly, incredibly important.
What a profound thing to say. And, I've had the pleasure of speaking with a great many identical twins, and their experiences of this twinship are so deep. And I see my two sons and how profoundly they love each other and how beautiful this type of relationship can be when it's at its best. And sadly, I've seen some of these identical twins deal with various forms of heartache, including, having one predecease. And one of the things that they describe is that my brother and I often didn't even need language to express a thing. We just knew. And I've never heard of a relationship at all quite like that. Has that been consistent with you and Gil?
Well, yes, his name is Gil. Thank you for that. We apparently, from what we were told, we had our unique language that we were language delayed, as many identical twins are, and we had our own language. And today you have amazingly adorable videos online of toddler twins, yapping at each other in unintelligible gibberish, but clearly there's a conversation going on and they're getting it and they're laughing at certain spots. And we don't have any video of that, which is there's heartbreak for me, because I would have loved to see that, but we don't. We do, A, know each other very, very well, and B, have obviously a lot of genetic overlap. And so that part in which, I know how he feels is because I know him so well. I know how I would feel so well. It's not difficult to me to understand how he would feel in certain situations. We do not have telepathy. People ask me about that all the time. Telepathy is not a proven thing. We don't have any examples that show that telepathy can be. We have some examples of statistical significance, but not of meaningful significance. In other words, if you do experiments thousands of times and instead of guessing at a 50% ratio, you guess at a 52% ratio, that can be statistically significant. It's not meaningful. Doesn't really help you if you're still guessing roughly at odds. And we tried those experiments, my brother and I. We spent, a time with cards trying to read each other's minds. And no, didn't work. We don't really have that. But you do know somebody so well. And if you know yourself well enough, then you really can anticipate not just how they would feel, but what they might say, what they might do. You really do know the lay of the land in that way.
God, you've written a few books, and in one of them, you speak a bit about the difference between positive and self-affirmations. And I think that's an important piece. I was wondering if you'd share, what is a positive affirmation? What is a self-affirmation? How do they work? How do they not work?
That's such an important question because people get this very, very wrong and they don't know what the science shows. So positive affirmations are what you will see at the bottom of calendars, on refrigerator magnets. Stuart Smalley, the character on Saturday Night Live. It's when you're looking into the mirror and saying, I'm beautiful and I'm worthy of love. You look at yourself, sometimes the mirror isn't gold, sometimes not, but you say to yourself, I'm going to be a great success. I'm going to be a great success. It's a positive affirmation. What we know scientifically is that positive affirmations tend to work for one group of people and not work for the other group of people who are practicing them. Unfortunately, the people for whom positive affirmations do work are people with high self-esteem. The people for whom they don't work are people with low self-esteem, who are the people who actually need them. Not only they don't work, they make them feel worse. If you just got rejected from a date and you're feeling unattractive and unworthy, looking in the mirror and saying, I'm beautiful and I'm worthy of great love will fall so far outside the domain of what's believable to you. It will actually feel almost slightly mocking. It will actually feel as if this is so untrue. There's something pathetic about the fact that I'm trying to tell that to myself. And so positive affirmations really don't work well for the very people who are most likely to need them and practice them. However, self-affirmations do. Self-affirmations are individualized, personalized forms of positive affirmation. So people who have invested in the books and the magnets and the calendars can convert positive affirmations to self-affirmations by making them A, personal, and B, true to themselves. So after you got rejected, don't look in the mirror and say, I'm beautiful and I'm worthy of love. Say what you know to be true. I have beautiful eyes. And if I keep looking, I know I'm going to find the right person at some point. If I keep putting myself out there, eventually I'll meet the person I'm going to end up with. So don't look and say, I'm going to be a great success when you just got fired from your job. Look out there and say, I have a strong work ethic. I bring a lot to the table. I'm reliable. I'm responsible. I'm the kind of person and a different kind of boss will appreciate. This one didn't, but I have so many good qualities. In other words, you remind yourself of what you bring to the table. You don't just throw out a positive affirmation, and you certainly don't try and dwell on what you don't bring to the table.
What I love about this is these are realistic and accurate accountings of what's going on, not the I'm good enough, smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, as you mentioned, kind of the Stuart Smalley from SNL, which was funny and yet not super helpful if we try to apply it, if particularly we fall in that subset. I know I do. And I can't help but thinking about kind of the Stockwell phenomenon in which prisoners of war who were overly optimistic said, I'll be out of this prison by X date, or things will get better and better, didn't fare very well. They actually suffered from broken hearts themselves, whereas those who had a realistic approach. So it seems like the big differentiator between the positive and self-affirmations is the realistic component, me saying, I am socially intelligent. I will find a way to connect with the audience versus, I've got the abs of Brad Pitt. Come on. We know that's not true. Don't I wish?
Right. We are very suggestible as people, and we think children are suggestible. They are very, very much so. So are adults, less so than children a lot of the time, but still quite suggestible. We can see this, for example, from priming certain words that then people unconsciously will lead people to evaluate things based on the prime they were given rather than based on the reality. That suggestibility is also to your own thoughts and to your own vocalizations. So your mind knows that you're feeling like crap. So when you look in the mirror and say, I'm all that, your mind goes like, no, you're not, certainly not right now. But when you look in the mirror and say, there is so much here that I have to offer, which is true. And again, if realistic, your mind won't reject that. And that can then sit with you and give you hope. And so, by the way, the exercise, I just want to give it for your listeners. The exercise to do to recover from rejection is if it's in the romantic domain or if it's in any other domain, make a list of qualities you know you have that are valuable in that domain. In the romantic domain, what makes you a good dating partner or relationship partner? In the work domain, what makes you a good employee? In the friend domain, what makes you a good friend? Whatever that would be. And make a list. And if it's romantic, so it can be things like I have great eyes. It can be things like I make unparalleled muffins. I give a great massage. I'm so sociable. In-laws love me, etc. I'm emotionally available, etc. Make a list and make it exhaustive, make it long. And then every day, choose one of the items and write a 2-paragraph short essay that no one's going to see. So it can be grammatically incorrect and whatever. Don't worry about the spelling, but just articulate why this quality is important, why it will be meaningful or has been in the past or would be in the future, why it's important that you're emotionally available. And because people will appreciate that I'm not playing games and that I'm there for them and allows me to actually connect in a way that they'll feel, etc. Articulate, remind yourself all you have to offer. Do one of those a day until you're feeling better. That will boost and revive your self-esteem. And especially if you lay off the self-criticism, that will serve for a much quicker recovery than just looking and saying things to yourself or in the mirror or silently that really there's a part of you that doesn't.
And I'm thinking about one of the greatest ways that we can reduce our anxiety is by increasing our confidence, which is a glib thing to say, but you're actually coming up with the framework through which confidence in ourselves is increased by regularly repeating in our soundtracks throughout life truth that our actual virtues about who we actually are is a good form, perhaps, of rumination, or at least something better on our Spotify soundtrack in life than perhaps some of the other soundtracks we might listen to, which you've certainly described in your TED Talks and your writing. And you're nodding. You want to say something on that?
Yeah, I just was something about self-criticism, because people will say to me like, but how do I make an accurate accounting? Like, I need to take responsibility. I need to look at what my mistakes were. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. When you get rejected, if you want to look at, well, did I contribute to that in some way? Absolutely do so. When you fail at something, should you look at what you could have done differently? Absolutely do so. The part to not do, it's fine to say, maybe I shouldn't have texted them 3 times after the first date. That's something to take. No, that's fine to say, but that's not how people say it.
No, I agree.
What people say is, I'm such an idiot. Why did I text them 3 times after the first date? I'm such an idiot. Loser. I'm a loser. The idiot, the loser part actually didn't add anything. You got the right message without the self-criticism. Self-criticism doesn't mean self-accountability. Accountability, good. Responsibility, good. It's the critical piece. You don't need to slap yourself in the face, metaphorically, as you're doing it. That actually distracts you from the learning that you might attain otherwise.
That's right. And the idea of incurring that form of resistance in self-criticism increases suffering rather than learning. And somehow along the way, many of us may have unwittingly signed on to some form of contract with authorities in which we came to the wrong conclusion that it's virtuous to self-flagellate. And that's the only way we'll actually learn, when you're actually saying it will impair learning.
There is a lot we learn in our upbringings, a lot of it from religious institutions about the joys of self-flagellation. And joys are very much a parenthesis in that sentence. And again, I'm all for personal accountability. Mm-hmm. I'm all for personal responsibility. I'm all for learning from mistakes. But when you savage, in other words, but do it like a compassionate, parent yourself in a compassionate way rather than in a punitive or abusive way. It truly doesn't add, and it does take away. And if you're trying to improve your confidence by learning what to do better, there's zero need to tell yourself you're an idiot and a loser or you're ugly or this or that. Doesn't help you learn the lesson, and it lowers your confidence, which makes you more prone to feeling rejection as painful, to feeling more anxious because you have less confidence and certainty in your life. All those things matter.
So much really that you and I believe other therapists would espouse is the idea that the middle path is the good one. And you're saying, don't overblow the data. Yes, I texted her 3 times after the date. Maybe I look at that. Maybe I don't do that in the future, but I don't blow it out of proportion. I don't attack myself or name call. I simply say, data received, not going to happen again. I've learned. And that is, I believe, the true virtue, is being able to accurately, without inflating or deflating what we've done, and say, okay, good data.
Or we even say to ourselves like, yeah, maybe I texted 20 times, but I have to forgive myself for being a little too eager, a little too enthusiastic. What can I do next time to monitor that or to manage my expectations so I don't feel so eager that will make me want to do? Again, that's where the learning is, but not if you're criticizing yourself along the way.
And if we get curious about it, we may even see that behind the error,
enthusiasm.
The enthusiasm is a strength, right?
Yeah, the enthusiasm is a wish to connect.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's all good stuff behind it. So, and we're all works in progress. We can all learn all the time.
So, Guy, as a final question, if somehow you were bestowed the magical powers to confer upon all humanity one trait, skill, or insight that would vastly improve the lives of individuals and perhaps society at large, what would that skill, insight, or awareness be? And what do you imagine the impact of having that skill, insight, or would be on the individual as well as society at large?
Self-compassion. Because self-compassion is what we were just talking about. It is being able to be realistic, but compassionate. It is being able to understand the context. It's being able to see yourself as flawed and evolving, as human and as learning. And of course, you're going to make mistakes. And of course, you're going to embarrass yourself once in a while as somebody who's done that on stage with frequency. I know that to be true. Of course, things don't always go your way. Of course, there are going to be setbacks. But if you can treat yourself with compassion, you'll recover for them more quickly. It would increase your sense of kindness towards others. People who are self-compassionate tend to be kinder toward others because they tend to judge others with similar levels of compassion. So do I think self-compassion is a kind of panacea that can really root out a lot of what's wrong with us today? Yeah. Kind of simplistic as that might sound, people don't practice it, and they don't practice it correctly sometimes when they do. But if people could actually evolve and develop that muscle, so it was a big muscle, and they went to it again and again and again, they would not become lazier. They would not become less proactive. They would not become less than. They would not be less ambitious. Everything in their lives would improve, and I think in the lives of the people around. So for me, I'm sorry for sounding so strident, but to me, that's the winner by far.
I couldn't agree more. And you accurately intuited if this was the Family Feud, that would be the number one answer from my guests.
Yeah. There we go.
But the way you articulated it was your own and unlike anything I've heard. And speaking of which, your books, your TED Talks, your podcast, your writing in general, your Google Talks, they are phenomenal. You as a guest and a host are really acting as a great emissary to the public for our field. And I'm just so grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
I feel the same about your work. And thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Oh, thanks so much, Guy. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.